Could I invite Kenji, Chad, and Arne to join me on the stage, please? Hello. Morning. Right, I'm going to start with you, Kenji, I think, because you are exactly the right person to be asking these questions right now, because you have just published a report titled Out in the World, Securing LGBT Rights in the Global Marketplace, that is obviously, hitting the topic of this panel right on the bullseye. So why did you write that report, and what did you find? What are the headlines of the report itself?
Great. So first of all, Tom, thank you so much to you and The Economist for hosting this, and thank you all for being here. It's really an honor. With regard to the report, the impetus behind the report was this notion that 93% of companies have LGBT policies protecting LGBT rights, but over 75 countries have laws in their books that criminalize same-sex sexual conduct. So what happens when multinational companies go into those jurisdictions? That was the question that we tried to answer in the report. And this is the first study of its kind, at least that we know of. So my co-author, Sylviane Hewlett, who's an economist, and I bucketed out 10 different geographies into red, yellow, and green zones. So it's traffic light coding depending on how good or bad the laws in that country are. So in our red zone, we had India, Russia, and Singapore. In our yellow zone, we had China, Hong Kong, and Turkey. And in our green zone, we had Brazil, South Africa, the UK, and the US. And so some of the things, Tom, are quite intuitive. So 80% of people in Russia are closeted at work, whereas the number falls to 46% in the United States. But some of the numbers are counterintuitive, and this is why we do studies like this, where 42%, taking the same two countries, of people in Russia have experienced discrimination in the past 5 years in the workplace. Whereas guess what the number in the United States is? Exactly the same, 42%. So we think that the explanation for this is that the two sets of statistics are related to each other, that if you are out, you're more likely to be discriminated against, right? But we need, right, to answer these questions with data, right? These are not theoretical questions, they're empirical questions. And so that's why we went out and did this study.
It's very impressive that you have all these figures up your sleeve. So you're going to be doing this study again in subsequent years and looking at how the numbers change, that sort of thing?
We hope to do it longitudinally, yes.
Okay, brilliant. So as to the main question that we're addressing today, the business case for LGBT inclusivity and diversity, looking at multinational firms in particular, what, just, from first principles, what is their motive for advancing LGBT rights?
Great. So you could fairly say, you can be for LGBT rights, but why should corporations be for this, given that corporations are neither philanthropic nor advocacy organizations? And essentially, we believe that there are three legs to that stool. So there's the talent imperative, the consumer imperative, and the innovation imperative. So just really quickly, 72% of people across all 10 markets who are allies, not LGBT, but allies, said that they would be more likely to work for a company that was pro-LGBT. Right? When we turn to the war for consumers, the LGBT market, again, not counting the ally market, but just the LGBT market, is quantified at $3.7 trillion, right? And over 70% of LGBT individuals and over 80% of allies said that they would be more likely to buy a good or service from a pro-LGBT company. Right? And then finally, with regard to the innovation imperative, right, 27% of individuals who said they had an LGBT individual on their team said they felt like they understood the end user to create a new good or service, whereas that number went up to 68%, right, when you had even one individual who was gay on the team.
So is that just the mercenary identification of new markets? Or is it, because there's been other research from places like Google that show that more diversity within teams generally leads to more creativity, more points of view, more innovation. That's a slightly broader version of what you've said. You're just talking about identifying market segments, but is there that broader ability to innovate that is associated with greater diversity of all kinds?
Exactly. So it's a both and. So it's both understanding specifically the LGBT end user, but it's also more broadly coming to better outcomes because you're hitting the problem from many different angles. And I would actually carry that point and export it over to a point that I made earlier, where when we're talking about the talent imperative, when we say 72% of allies are more likely to work for a pro-LGBT company, that's not just individuals who even identify as allies. There are knock-on effects for Asian women as well. So there's a great story that we have coming out of a company where there's a recruitment fair, and all these Asian women are coming up to the LGBT, MBA table, and then the recruiter finally says, "What's going on? You cannot all be Asian American female, lesbians, right?" And the answer was, you've signaled your real commitment to diversity, because LGBT is currently the hardest nut to crack. So if you're going to treat your LGBT employees fairly globally, right, then you are much more likely to treat Asian Americans and women fairly, right? So even if those individuals didn't identify as allies, they understood the signaling effect.
Okay, brilliant. We'll definitely come to you in a minute. I don't want you to think I'm going to just talk to Kenji, but he has...
Oh, this is very interesting.
We're enjoying it. Keep talking.
It's great, isn't it? But he has really sort of got the template through which I think, to look at the issues we're looking at today. In particular, you have a sort of taxonomy of strategies that companies can follow when they have to operate across lots of different legal and cultural environments. So tell us what those strategies are.
Great. So we have these three models, and so we break it out into the when in Rome model, the embassy model, and the advocate model. So under the when in Rome model, the notion is the laws in the country are so draconian that you just have to roll over and adhere to the norms of the country. And essentially, this occurs because you have two imperatives as companies. One is to, abide by the laws of the jurisdiction. So if you're in Uganda, you have to abide by Uganda's laws, when in Rome. And then the other one is you have to guarantee the safety of your people. Right? So, I was talking to Lord Brown about this. He was one of our interviewees for this former CEO of BP. And he said, look, Kenji, if you're in Nigeria, right, and, Joe comes out at work because you've created a safe environment for him, but then his colleagues tell some thugs in the, sort of ambient culture, that he's gay, and he gets beaten up or killed because of that, that blood is on our hands, right? And so our first responsibility is to keep our people safe. So this is not a shame or blame report. This notion is sometimes you can't do anything more than when in Rome, but you can still have best practices, right, under each of these three models. So the best practices for when in Rome are transparency, let people know what your policies are, so they can opt out. Relatedly, when people opt out, let them opt out without penalty, right? So if I don't want to be assigned to Nigeria or Uganda because I'm gay, and I say that, then I should be able to be assigned somewhere else, or at least not suffer a career penalty for that. Right? And then finally, constant monitoring, because a lot of times, and both of you will understand this better than I, the local offices throw up these firewalls saying our laws don't permit this, when in fact, if you have the laws translated and you look at them, they don't say that at all. So in our study, we give the example of an LGBT video that a company that was a multinational wanted to show in their Russian office. The Russian office said, no, we can't show that, it's against our laws. And then the hub said, give us the law. They translated it. They realized that it was an anti-propaganda law that said you can't disseminate propaganda about non-traditional families to minors. So given that there were no minors involved, they showed the video, right? Given that they were able to thread the needle with regard to the law.
Okay, so that's when in Rome.
Yep, so the embassy model just carries the analogy of saying, many people say that multinational corporations are taking on a statist quality. So this is like Frank Dobbin at Harvard, the sociologist, among others. So if we carry that metaphor, then your local offices can also operate as embassies. So you can create these footprints, right, in these anti-gay countries where your pro-gay norms apply, right? So I want to just shorthand this and say, obviously, your policies and your role models and your ERGs, your employee resource groups could be examples of policies that would carry over. But to just give you one statistic that I think sums it all up, IBM is a wonderful self-ID program, right? And what they do is that they say it is both the case and known to be the case that only 2 individuals within the entire company have access to the LGBT database. So if you flag yourself as LGBT, only the chief talent officer and her technician, who allows her to access that database, will have access to that information. When they rolled this out, I know I'm not supposed to talk in emotive terms because I'm supposed to be a researcher, but this was a haunting statistic. 20 individuals in IBM India belong to their LGBT affinity group. But when they rolled out self-ID, over 1,000 individuals in IBM India self-identified as LGBT. So sometimes a statistic is worth 1,000 words. If you think about the discrepancy between 20 individuals and over 1,000 individuals, that gives you a sense of the pain point here. And then finally, before I turn it over to my illustrious panelists, or co-panelists, I want to just go over the advocate model. And the advocate model says we're not just going to be content with staying on our footprint and having these kind of cordoned off spaces where people are safe. We actually want to push out into the culture. So it's more interesting when the pressure of application goes both ways. So rather than just experiencing pressure from the culture, we're going to push out our company norms into the country as a whole. So the classic instance of this is what many individuals did, both behind the scenes and very much front and center on stage with regard to bills like Uganda's anti-homosexuality bill. So again, Chad would know about this better than I, but it's still a horrible, draconian, awful bill. It's odious, right? But at least the death penalty provision got cut off of it. And the reason that it got excised was primarily because of the intervention of multinational corporations that said this is going too far, right? So they were able to stop that. Working with local advocates would be a softer form of intervention rather than direct lobbying. So that would be the second example of a best practice under the advocate model. So that would be something like supporting Pink Dot. So as many of you know, in Singapore, there are not only anti-gay laws, there are also censorship laws. So people are very scared. I've spoken in Singapore. People in the audience are crying, but nobody asks a question. It's very different when I've given talks in Japan or in India or what have you, because they have free speech norms that offer more protection there. But in Singapore, at least one day a year in Hong Lim Park, which is their equivalent to Speaker's Corner, there's this event called Pink Dot, which is an LGBT rally, which was a relatively, and as I understand it, anemic affair until corporations got involved and gave the imprimatur and respectability of corporate America to this and allowed their brands to be used. And last year, 28,000 individuals gathered in Hong Lim Park for this rally, which suddenly seemed to be much more family-friendly, which seemed to be much more about human rights and less about social deviancy. And then finally, and this is the last thing I'll say, there's soft forms of advocacy, right? So symbolic support. And symbolic activism often gets a bad name because people say, oh, well, what are you really talking about? But let me just give you one example of what I consider to be effective symbolic advocacy. When Facebook had a hackathon, 2 straight interns within Facebook said, we want to create rainbow filters that people can put on their profiles to support LGBT rights around the great marriage equality work that Chad was doing. And this went viral internally. And then a gay vice president, Alex Schultz of Facebook, said, I think that we should do this externally as well. So they pushed it out. As of the time we did the study, 26 million individuals had changed their Facebook profiles to have the rainbow filter, and that had generated over 500 million likes and comments. Right? So we live in a world of symbols, so I don't want to downplay the fact that symbols can have. So we have a spectrum under the advocate model of everything from that symbolic action to the direct lobbying that we saw in Uganda.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Chad, but before we do, I just wanted to ask one thing about these 3 models. You put the countries in your study into 3 bins, red, yellow, and green. Is it the same with the strategies that companies are doing one or other of those, or actually is it a mixture?
Yeah, companies do not sort themselves, thank you, according to the 3 different models. So to backtrack for those of you who are listening in internationally, what I'm trying to answer is, do companies sort themselves cleanly into these 3 different models of when in Rome, embassy, and advocate? And the answer is no. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. Every company that we studied that was a multinational had policies that were in different models depending on where they were. So if you're in Uganda, sometimes you have no choice but to adopt, as one company, so as Marriott, to adopt the one in Rome model. And there's a totally principled reason to do that, so long as you follow the best practices. But in other countries, say you're in an amber zone, a yellow zone, so you're in China or Hong Kong, then you can do more. So maybe the embassy model is indicated. In a green zone, you might want to engage in more advocacy. And then, to tie a bow on it, sometimes even in the red zone countries, you want to be both engaging in the when in Rome and the advocate model at the same time, right? Because, and I've already described that, right? At the granular level, at the retail level of saying, are we guaranteeing the safety of our employees? You want to say, we can't guarantee our employees anything here, so we want to signal that. But on the other hand, at the kind of macro level, right, at the wholesale level, you can actually be intervening as a company with the Ugandan legislature to excise the death penalty from the anti-homosexuality bill. So both models are in play, even in the same country.
Okay, brilliant. I think we should, this report that you've written is available online. I think we should, Adam, who's doing our social media at the back, if you could find a link to it and tweet it so that everyone here has can find it and read it, because it sounds like there's a lot of really good practical advice in there. What I'd like to do is I'd like to move from Kenji and your take on what companies could do to Chad and what companies are actually doing, because you have this survey, and then finally a worked example of from Arne of what a company is doing in practice. So Chad, if I could come to you, HRC produces this corporate equality index. Tell us what that is and where LGBT rights fit into your assessment criteria.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us here today. First and foremost, I should say we endorse the advocate model. And many companies that are represented in this room, and I know that are joining us online, and Marriott and others have been instrumental in the change that we've seen here in this country and increasingly around the world. But you don't have to go very far back to a time where this country certainly would not have been a green country, right? We still have a long ways to go here in this country. But in this report, we're green. Just go back to the 90s and the early 2000s, right? The state of life in this country legally for LGBT people was we had Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? We had DOMA. We had no hate crime protections. And until 2003, in states like Texas, you could be prosecuted for being gay. So in the movement, advocates were at a place of, well, what now, right? What now? What do we do? There was no end in sight at that time to bring about full equality in this country. And so we needed some disruptive action. We needed a disruptive force as advocates. And so in 2002, the Corporate Equality Index was created. And the idea was to, in a transparent way, work with business and then score businesses, so create a competitive model in terms of how companies treat their LGBT employees, right? What kind of protections, what kind of non-discrimination protections, what kind of benefits, what kind of environment is created? Is there an employee resource group? What is the state of life for LGBT people? We started that in 2002. 13 companies scored a perfect 100 in 2002. In just a few weeks, actually in this very room, in a few weeks, we'll be honoring the companies this year that scored the perfect 100. And there'll be 400 companies, many of whom are in this room today, which is incredible. Now, our job as advocates is to continue to push the envelope and frustrate perhaps some of you in the room, and continue to raise that bar. And I just want to give you one example of how raising the bar can bring about phenomenal change. On the issue of trans-inclusive healthcare, in 2002, there were no companies that provided trans-inclusive healthcare. We began the discussion with companies throughout the years, and then in 2009, we really started to implement the requirement. In order to score the perfect 100, you have to have trans-inclusive healthcare. So today, more than 40% of Fortune 500 companies have trans-inclusive healthcare. That number should be 100%, but that is incredible progress, right? Now for a second, switch into the advocacy model. If you just go back to 2008 during the Prop 8 battle in California, we had a couple of companies that joined us on that. Then you look at the Supreme Court. By the time the marriage cases reached the Supreme Court, we had more than 300 companies sign the brief for marriage equality. And it's so important, and here's why. I come here today from Atlanta. I was in Georgia yesterday, where we had this hateful anti-LGBT bill before the state legislature. Business is a key ingredient to stopping that. Without business, we wouldn't have gotten the anti-trans bill vetoed in South Dakota. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to win in Georgia because business has joined us, right? Business has stepped outside the boardroom and into the public square and are making the case why these hateful bills are bad for business, are bad for the economy, and will truly cause a state to lose jobs. Now, transfer that to the global scale. Just a few weeks ago, actually the three of us and many of you in this room were at the World Economic Forum in Davos, right? We did an event just across the street at the Microsoft headquarters with Dan Bross and others who I know are here in the room. And we talked about this very research. We had business leaders in the room, we had executives in the room, we had political leaders in the room. But right across the street, literally 10 feet across the street, were the leaders of the countries, the 75 countries where it's illegal to be LGBT, and the 10 countries where it's punishable by death. They were literally feet across the street at the World Economic Forum. Why were they there? Why were so many businesses there? Why were so many CEOs there? Those countries want your jobs. They want to keep the jobs that you've already brought to their countries, and they want you to bring more. And so business leaders in business have an ability to bring about change, to engage in a conversation. Sometimes it's a private meeting that we as advocates can't do, and even as government leaders can't do. You know, we hosted a forum with the Vice President Davos with 20 CEOs of global companies, and he looked around the room and he talked about how when he or when the president today, meets with a head of state in a bilateral meeting, always these issues are on the table, and they're brought up and they're discussed, right, in our diplomatic channels. But he then went to the next level and said, but you can do things we can't do. You have more power in many instances in these countries than advocates do, local advocates, and political leaders, including folks like the president and the vice president of the United States. And so the partnership between business here in this country and increasingly on the global scale, the partnership with business is a key ingredient to our success. Not the only ingredient, but without this partnership, we would not be where we are in the United States today, and we will not get to where we want to get globally without American companies and companies around the globe joining us in these fights.
This year's Corporate Equality Index, I believe, for the first time includes non-discrimination protections for not just domestic operations, but for global operations. So that's again, a raising of the bar that you have to show that you've implemented this globally. What guidance are you giving companies about what that means to implement things globally, given that you have anti-LGBT legislation in many countries and you have these different models that Kenji has laid out? What do I have to do if I'm a company to get that perfect score?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I think it's important to understand how that inclusion of global non-discrimination came about in the CEI. It came, one, because many folks who work in these companies, right, many ERG leads would say to us, hey, perhaps quietly, we have these protections here in this country. My colleagues and I are all so protected when we're here. But our brothers and sisters who are stationed around the globe, they don't have those same protections. Those non-discrimination protections that we have here that are understood by our CEO and by our corporate leaders here, they're not even on the radar of some of the executive leadership in the country. And as Paul Boskin, who I know is in the room, who's on our board, was instrumental in starting this with us, as we were having these conversations with many of you, as well as with some of our ambassadors who were saying to us, one country in particular, our ambassador said, your CEI is incredible, but let me tell you, I meet with the leadership of those same companies that are based here. They may on paper have them in the US, but they're not realized over here. And so that's what led to these conversations in partnership with business, and that's what led us to implement the requirement that the non-discrimination protections that you have here in this country, in order to achieve that perfect score, you have to apply those globally. Now comes to the question of enforcement. Well, we don't have an army of people to go and enforce this and look in each company. But you know what? In many ways, it self-enforces. Because just by making this public and making this known, right, it has impact. But let me tell you, an enforcement mechanism are the ERG leads, the employee resource groups, and the leadership that are in these companies. Because the moment that something's not going right, now they have an ability to raise this. Now they have license to stand up and to speak out, which they really didn't have before. And so look, I'm sure that we're going to continue to look at how we can raise the bar and how we can do more on the global scale. At the same time that we implemented this requirement, we also launched a Global Business Coalition for Equality that today are 20 businesses with a global footprint that have come together and made a statement about their commitment around these issues and about their leadership in working to bring about change in their countries, but also, in their companies, but also to be real models and real leaders to partner with other companies so that they can do the same.
Okay, I think that brings us neatly to Arne Sorenson of Marriott, one of the companies, we should say, that had a perfect score on the CEI this year. So tell us about how this works in practice, because you obviously have to operate in all parts of the world, many of which are openly hostile to LGBT people, both staff and customers. How does that work in practice?
Well, first, thank you. It's great to be with you all this morning. It's great to listen to both Kenji and Chad, two stalwarts in helping us figure these things out. And I think we come to this first with a focus on our talent, not really so much focused on the business opportunity of LGBT community as our customers, although that's a profound one too. But because we think by taking care of our people, they'll do better in their work, they'll stay with us longer, our turnover will be lower, they'll celebrate better, they'll bring our customers back over and over again. We have for decades said we put our people ahead of our customers because we can only get to our customers through our people. And so that is our first and foremost agenda. And of course, that's an agenda that has been almost revolutionized, you think, here in the United States in the last 3 to 5 years. We've got to make sure that momentum continues. It is not something that starts in the CEO's office with an edict that goes down, but it's very much a conversation with our people, with our employee resource group. And it's not a sort of that group of people against the company saying, why don't you move faster in this space? But it is us working together and saying, okay, where are the issues that are problematic to us? That group is a global group today. And so that group helps us, and the research like Kenji has done recently will help us figure out, are we making the right choices in these places around the world?
So with these three strategies that he has, how are you using are you essentially doing the embassy model primarily?
I think I think each of those models is playing out in different places. And I think our people are helping us get there. Now, that we haven't started with the sort of statistical work and the philosophical work that Kenji had, but I think we end up very much in the same place, where if we're running a hotel in a market in which homosexuality is illegal, there are folks, obviously we have LGBT community members that work in that hotel. They may not tell us because it is deeply personal and it is highly risky in that environment. And they've got to make a decision about whether or not they're going to come out and say, I'm here and I want Marriott to do something in this environment. But we are in each one of these hotels, we're a community, and that community could be 50 people or it could be 1,000 people working in that hotel. And how do they come out and say, here's who we are, here's what we need. Do we need to be protected? Do we need to be made safe in an embassy sort of environment where we can feel liberated, at least while we're at work, and appreciated for that? And then in what places do we really need you to be an advocate and talk to other folks in government or in the community? And again, we didn't start with the philosophical approach that Kenji has described, but it actually fits, I think, for what we're doing. I think in some markets in the world, I suspect most of the members of our LGBT community are not out. And we don't go out and survey them. One of the great things about your work is you can go out and survey folks. I actually would shudder to think about our going out and asking our 350,000 people around the world, are you a member of the LGBT community? Because that is, some may not want to tell us, and I don't necessarily want to put them in the position where they feel like they're obligated to tell us. But so when they come out and say, here's what we want from you, or maybe they don't come out, maybe they say, I'm an ally member of our group is called One, global group. I can be engaged in that conversation without actually having to come out personally. And in the context of that conversation, I can say in a country in Africa or in India or in Saudi or in some other market around the world, here's what we need. Here's what we need while we're in the hotel. Here's what we need in the community that we're in. And here's what we would ask Marriott to do to help advocate for us. And I think a quickly evolving but very difficult and very personal set of issues.
One of the things that we touched on earlier on, and in fact we heard it in our opening video interview as well, is this question of whether companies have an opportunity to advocate in a way that governments don't. If governments say, if Hillary Clinton says LGBT rights are really important to Uganda, or Joe Biden does, or whatever, that can be depicted as US imperialism. It's trying to impose Western values on other countries. Whereas companies have a slightly different situation. But at the same time, are you not accused of basically, is this not colonialism, imperialism, call it whatever you like? How do you respond to that charge when it's raised against you?
I don't.
Is it not? Do you just manage not to trip that wire?
This is not that kind of debate. Now, you talk about Vice President Biden. I remember being in the White House a few years ago, and he's a famous talker, of course. His speech was long at your last gala. But he started.
Arne was there.
He started in this conversation by saying to me and to a couple of other CEOs, "You guys are all cowards. You never speak out about anything." It was not about these issues. It was something much less interesting. But he ended it by saying, "And you have no influence." And so those things are fundamentally contradictory, right? We have some influence, and we can use influence. We use that influence not necessarily, though, by getting into a political debate, but instead by coming out and saying, here's what our position is. And so you think about something much closer to home, Indiana's move a year ago. I was down the street, gave a speech. I didn't realize there were television cameras there. I didn't regret that they were, but I called the legislation madness. And other companies stepped in, Apple and others. But that to us was a very concrete business issue, which was obviously not only as it was wrong policy, but Indiana immediately was going to be suffering from a boycott where people were going to pull their group business away from that state. Indiana is filled with welcoming people who are kind and thoughtful. To put that kind of reputation on the billboard for Welcome to Indiana is ridiculous from a commercial perspective. And I think by saying that, we didn't have to respond then to a debate. We didn't, people undoubtedly criticized me for the speech, but you don't have to come out and defend it. But the governor and the legislature heard that from us and from other companies. And I think they responded to that in a way that was much faster than it would have been if simply politicians with a different perspective had responded. Because that would have been the normal political debate. And instead they said, you know what, this is going to hurt our state, and we better move.
Chad, what's your take on this, whether companies have more influence than governments, which would be a surprising turnabout if...
Yeah, they have a different kind of influence on government. But to the point in what you were just asking Arne, I think it's important to note, first and foremost, I think it's important to state the obvious, right? There are just as many LGBT people in Nigeria and Uganda and Russia and Iran and Syria as there are here in the United States, right? Per capita, there are just the same, right? Those people need the same kind of protections just like folks do in other places. So that is not a Western idea per se. I said something early on about business is not the only ingredient to bring about these changes. You also need the local advocates that are on the ground, that are doing the hard work, that are facing great risk, and they are brave folks day in and day out. That's also part of this work. in working with the local advocates that are on the ground, hearing what they need, hearing the kind of help that they need in order to win these battles. But I also think it's important for all of us to bring this to a human level, right? We're all talking about this up here in terms of the change and the battles and the political battles and the issues with inside a company. But I think it's really important to note this. Regardless of which one of those models a company is, life happens in 4 places for most folks: home, school, and church. And then where they go to work. For most LGBT people around the globe, they are rejected at home, they're rejected at church, and they were rejected in school and in the communities that they call home. Rejected from around their own dinner table. And sometimes the consequences of that are life-threatening, right? Many folks in this room may have even been in those situations. Having the CEO of one of the largest companies in the world communicating to employees that we value you, he values you, and accepts you and protects you and embraces you, that not only makes them a good worker, where they can bring their full self to the extent possible to the job, it can also actually save their lives. And I think that is a really, really important piece of this puzzle that often gets left off of the table. Because Arne's not going to actually hear the story of that employee whose life he saved because he's standing up as an ally and because he's speaking out and because he's protecting that back office worker that he may never meet. And that is the same with corporate leadership all across this globe. And I think it's important for all of us to always come back to the actual lives that are being protected and saved, not just their experience at the office and their return as a worker to the job.
We have only a few minutes left on this panel. I think I would like to give people in the audience a chance to ask questions, so please raise your hand if you do have a question. We also have have we asked the Twitter question? Oh, here we go, the app question. So we're going to ask a question to the app, and if you haven't logged in, it's first dot last name, and the password is Economist. That's really sound security policy there, isn't it? Anyway, never mind. Yeah, we were going to go for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but we thought, that's too easy to guess. So anyway, here's the question we'd like to ask through the app, and we've also asked this on Twitter, which is, when will... Oh, hang on a minute. Sorry, this is a question from the app. It's not the question we're asking in the app. So good. This is another use of the app. We'll get to the other question in a minute. Someone is asked through the app, when will the HRC Equality Index get more in depth to examine LGBT equality in business? And is there a plan to align it with something like the UK Stonewall Equality Index? So that's one for you, Chad.
I'm not certain exactly what the first part of that question means, but let me tell you where we hope to evolve the CEI. Increasingly, if you look at some of the US companies that are participating today, they actually have more employees in other countries and other regions in the world than they do here. We this year launched our first ever CEI. We launched it in Mexico City. We actually launched it at the Dow headquarters in Mexico City, where we had not just the leadership and the presidents of the Mexican divisions of these companies join us, but we also had a number of Mexico-based companies join us. And I think ultimately what we would like and love to have the resources to be able to do would be to have companies around the world, some of the largest employers, actually participate in the CEI. And that's something we've talked about. It's something that many of you have even suggested and talked with us about how that might work and how that would look. But I do hope that ultimately we can grow this index to not just the companies that are based here in the US, but companies that are the large employers based in other countries around the globe. I do think this is a model that can be replicated and can be grown and expanded and have even greater impact.
Great. Do we have any more questions piped through the app, or do we want to do actual human interaction? Okay, that screen's gone blue. So do we have any questions from the audience in person, as it were? I have a question here. Okay, question for Arne, if you didn't hear, which is, how does Marriott protect LGBT customers as opposed to just its staff, and how does it respect and protect their rights?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think hopefully we're protecting from a physical safety perspective all of our guests, and actually this is not an issue that comes up that frequently. We don't hear from folks even checking into a red zone country hotel as a hotel guest that something about what we're doing is leaving them feeling exposed. I think actually because we welcome everybody into our hotels everywhere, no matter really what the local laws are. We may not cross-examine them when they're checking in about who they are exactly, but we're welcoming everybody. And I think hopefully we're running a safe environment that at least in that sense, from a guest sense, not an associate sense necessarily, that is an embassy already. Even in a red zone world, red zone country, because it is a safe environment in that place. And so again, it's not something that comes up.
But you have done marketing campaigns aimed specifically at LGBT people, saying you will be welcome in our...
Well, we have a global campaign called Love Travels, which is very much a global campaign to welcome LGBT community and other members of diverse communities, and really broadcast this inclusiveness and essentially say to people, enjoy your travel and be who you are when you travel, and celebrate life when you travel. That's a marketing and a communication of a welcome, if you will, broadly. Maybe a little bit different than this point, am I safe when I get to a given market? I do think that sense of safe zone, the sense of embassy, does already apply around the world for our guests. I hope it does. When we're at our best, it does.
Okay, now we're going to try using the app for a poll. The question that we're asking is, should companies advance LGBT rights even if it could harm their commercial prospects in some countries? And this is a question we've already asked the Twitterati, and apparently we get to compare their answer with yours, so it'll be interesting to see. But please give your answer through the app, and I will magically be able to see what your answers are. Or at least I hope I will. While you all vote on that, I wanted to ask Kenji a question, which was why is it that you think that LGBT rights have moved farther and faster than previous rights movements? Because it is very striking that there does seem to have been, extraordinarily rapid progress, at least in the last few years.
Right. So this, too, thank you for the question, Tom. This, too, is in our report because it was a conundrum about why gay civil rights seems to be taking off like a hockey stick.
Right, this just
in. As compared to the racial civil rights or the feminist civil rights, at least in this country. So it's a question that deserves an answer. And our theory is that it has to do with two demographic attributes of gay people. So one is that gay people are invisible, right? So that we're physically invisible and have the capacity to pass, unlike women or racial minorities. And then the other one is that we are diffuse. We are evenly distributed in exactly the way that Chad just described, right? Now, think about this. Before there's a critical mass of gay people who are out, which we call the tipping point, both of those attributes are huge political disabilities for gay people. Because the fact that we can pass makes search and organization costs so much higher, and makes it possible for people to hide in the closet rather than fighting discrimination, right? And similarly, diffusion means that you're not born to your own, right? You're not born into a community that can vote out somebody into the Congress from a majority-minority district, right? You risk being disowned from your family. So that suggests why gays have been under the thumb, right, of the homophobic world, right, for so long. But once you get that critical mass of individuals who come out, both of those political vices, right, invisibility and diffuseness, immediately flip over into becoming virtues, right? So each vice can be urged into its nearest virtue, right? The fact that we're invisible means that once it becomes relatively safe to come out, people come out at the highest echelons of every sector because our capacity to pass means that gatekeeping mechanisms cannot be used against us to keep us out. So once it becomes safe for people to come out, then you get, Tim Cook in the corporate world, you get Anderson Cooper in the media, you get General Tammy Smith, in the military. So people at the highest echelons are coming out. When you get to diffuseness, once you reach this critical mass and this tipping point, suddenly diffuseness looks really good because every individual who comes out brings along a whole extended family of allies, right? Which is not the case with racial minorities, for example. Right? So this tipping point analysis means that we can expect the same thing to happen globally as has happened in this country, if I'm correct in my hypothesis, which is that this will be a nonlinear acceleration, and this will look much more like a hockey stick, right? And you only get one chance to be a pioneer, right? So I want to give Microsoft a shout out, right, for being the first to embrace a non-discrimination policy, right, here in this country, right? But we all have the chance to become pioneers in this global struggle. And if we were buying stock, right, in a social movement, this would be the social movement to buy stock in, right? Because this is going to be taking off like a hockey stick globally, right, for these two demographic characteristics, which, as Chad said, apply globally, right, in the same way that it has in this country.
Brilliant. I think that's a suitably optimistic note on which to end. Also, the results of the survey, 100% in favour, which is fantastic. So I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions, but thank you very much to Kenji Yoshino, Chad Griffin, and Arne Sorenson. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.